Instagram teen accounts have automatic protections for what teens see and who can contact them, plus time management tools. And Instagram will continue adding built-in safety features to help create age-appropriate experiences. Learn more about teen accounts and Instagram's ongoing work to protect teens online at instagram.com/teen accounts.
Adobe Acrobat, your new foundation. Use PDF spaces to generate a presentation. Grab your docs, your permits, your moves. AI levels up your pitch, gets it in a groove. Choose a template with your timeless cool. Come on now, let's flex those tools. Draft, design, deliver, make it sing. AI builds the deck so you can build that thing. Do that, do that, do that with Acrobat.
Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
The sound of praise for your Sunday morning.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Introducing Reverend A.R. Bernard of the Christian Cultural Center.
Was the son of a preacher man.
And Rabbi Joseph Potasnik of Religion on the Line.
The only one who could ever teach me.
Now, here's the Rev and the Rabbi, where faith matters.
Good morning, I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
We want to wish everyone who's celebrating Easter today, the Eastern Orthodox time of the year, a very, very healthy, happy Easter. So that's a whole issue with the calendar. Trying to get everybody on the same calendar, but of course there are traditions that remain sacred, and just want to bring to your attention.
Yeah, this is true. Easter.
Elias, do you have music to introduce our guest?
Uh-oh.
All
now
right.
we're being creative here. I love it.
All right. That music means one thing. It's Alan
shows.
Abramson, criminal defense attorney of the firm of Abramson and Morak. Good morning, Alan. Nice to have you with us.
Good morning, Rabbi. Good morning, Reverend. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well. That music just, stirred a question in me, but I don't know where Rabbi wants to start the conversation.
Well,
I'm curious about the tension between law and order.
Well, you know what's interesting, Rev? I was telling Alan off the air. We just concluded Passover, which is followed weeks later by Pentecost, Shavuot, and that's all about law. So freedom without law is not what it should be. You need freedom and law. So we're going to talk about First Amendment. We're going to talk about buffer zones. So, Alan, why don't you explain First Amendment to us, what it is, what it isn't?
Well, the First Amendment protects our freedom of speech, assembly, worship, but there's always a tension with the First Amendment. And in this case, what you have is your freedom to exercise your religion and pray in safety versus the right of people to express themselves and disagree and protest near houses of worship. And it's not an either-or situation. We have to provide safety for the people that are going to a house of worship, and we have to provide safety and a forum for the people that want to express their views, which may be very divergent from people that are using the house of worship. So it's a balance.
I want to ask you a question because everyone's the Constitution's collapsing and all of that. But in reality, there's fiction, there's reality. At the level of law, freedom of speech in the United States still remains exceptionally robust. Isn't that true? I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of the collapse of freedom of speech or the Constitution on this matter, are we?
No, I wouldn't be afraid of the loss of your ability to speak freely and protest, but it is under somewhat of an attack. And I think that just forces all of us to be ever more vigilant in protecting the freedom of speech and recognizing that sometimes it's not always neat. You hear things that you don't want to hear. You see things that you don't want to see. But people have the right to express themselves freely in this country. And there are compromises that have to be made, but we always have to keep our eye on the prize here, which would be a country where people can argue and debate and protest and say what they want, because ultimately that leads us to a better conclusion in how we handle our affairs.
You mentioned something about no right of protest inside a house of worship.
Yes, that's correct. I want to be very clear about that, because people have the right to protest outside of a house of worship, and there may be some restrictions to that. There may be time, place, and manner regulations. But the First Amendment doesn't apply inside a house of worship. A house of worship is a private facility, and the First Amendment protects us from government restriction of speech, not private restriction of speech. So a congregation of any sort can say, no, that you cannot protest in here. You get arrested if you protest inside a house of worship without the permission of the congregation.
So let me ask you a question. You brought it into the house of worship. Does the clergy have full freedom, if it's consistent with their religious tradition, to reject other people, or to speak ill or defame other people? Is that okay? That's allowed?
Well, defaming other people is not allowed. Defamation is an exception to the First Amendment. You're not allowed to engage in speech that will defame other people. And that's always been an exception to the First Amendment. But other than that, I mean, you have the right to limit whoever you want to come into the church or synagogue or mosque. Mm-hmm. You can make those choices. That is your right to freedom of assembly and association, and nobody has the right to come into the house of worship without the permission of the pastor or rabbi or congregation.
You know, to emphasize that freedom of speech, you may find that in some congregations, in the naming of the synagogue, for example, it says the Free Synagogue of Flushing or the Stephen Y. Free Synagogue. And the reason for the word free was to say that the pulpit was free. The rabbi could preach a sermon without imposition, without interference by others. That's how much they valued free speech, that even in the name itself, it was emphasized.
Mm-hmm.
That's a wonderful principle. I have to be candid, Rabbi. I did not know that, but that is marvelous.
Well, I do it for the Rev's sake. Now you're free.
I appreciate that.
Rev, to say what you want.
So, what about even offensive or extremist speech? Is that protected, even if it's likely to produce immediate violence?
Well, no. There are restrictions. There are some restrictions, and there are, again, time, place, and manner restrictions. Fighting words are not protected. But there's a difference between fighting words and words that you find offensive. Offensive things can be protected. But if your speech turns into something that poses an immediate danger, that speech can be limited. And that's always been true. That has always been true. There's no absolute right to your freedom of speech. There are many times when there can be reasonable restrictions that are placed on the freedom of speech, but they have to leave the person's right to speak freely robust.
So, Alan, let me ask, those who oppose, for example, a buffer zone, those who feel they have the right to protest, does that mean they feel they can protest in your face as you're walking into a house of worship? They don't accept the fact there should be a separation?
No, I don't think that's correct. But let me. The law that the city council recently passed that will allow the police department to set up buffer zones, that's going to be appealed once it passes by the New York Civil Liberties Union. And their approach is somewhat different than what you just said. They believe that there are currently laws on the books that prevent interference with religious worship. There are two different laws. There's a law that talks specifically about interference with religious worship. It's a misdemeanor. It talks about using force or threats or coercion to prohibit people or to interfere with someone exercising their religious freedom at a place of worship. And then there is a law about the disruption of religious services. That's prohibited also. So, and if you have a record of doing this, it becomes a felony. So there are laws on the books that that deal with these issues, and the Civil Liberties Union is going to appeal this based on primarily that concept. You don't have the right to stand in front of somebody or hit them. You have to allow them access, but you have to be able to get your message across.
We're coming close to a break, but when we come back, I'd love to understand the technological reality when it comes to this now, because there's a major shift in free speech when it comes to digital platforms that are supposedly private, like Meta, Facebook, Instagram, X, Google, YouTube. These are private companies, and how does this apply to utilizing those platforms and saying whatever you want? We've got to take a break. There'll be more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here on Red Apple Radio Networks.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, where faith matters. The Rev and the Rabbi. Where faith matters. The Rev and the Rabbi.
Good morning. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
And welcome back to our discussion with Alan Abramson of the firm of Abramson Morak. Alan, I see that we speak of the stairway to heaven and a highway to hell, which shows you where the congestion is, where it's going, which means people do need attorneys. They need criminal defense attorneys a number of times. Rev, I know you had a question that I want to follow up on.
Yeah. I just want to get back to private companies. These digital platforms like Facebook and Instagram and X and Google and YouTube. Does the First Amendment apply to them in the same way, or is it different standard?
Look, I think the overriding principle is that the First Amendment prohibits government interference with your free speech rights. Government interference, not private interference. And if it's solely a private company, then they can determine who has access to their platform, and they can discriminate based on what the message is of the speaker. But that's my position, that the only thing that is prohibited by the First Amendment is when government interferes, not private people, not private.
That's important. Yeah, that's a very important clarification, because people use it as a blanket statement, but there are situations where the same standard is not applicable, because now we're talking about, who decides what speech is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and
right, but so many times, Reverend, you hear people say, "Don't I have a First Amendment right?" I mean, a kid says that to his parents. "I have a First Amendment right." No, you don't. not in your house, not with your parents. You only have a First Amendment right to speak without the government telling you what you can and can't say.
That's why people have been thrown off, Meta or whatever other platforms, because they've exceeded certain standards that the company has raised.
That's right.
Let me ask you this. Suppose that you got a hybrid here. It's a private institution, a university, for example, receiving money from the government for research. How does that in any way impact the right to limit free speech if you're private but getting public money?
Yes, it does. It does. I'm sorry I jumped in like that, but that's a pretty clear principle. If a school or an institution is completely privately funded, they can discriminate against viewpoint, message, whatever they'd like. But if you are taking federal money, then that opens up the door to the federal government coming in and taking positions if you're going to be limiting the rights of people to speak freely on the campus.
Interesting. So,
go
ahead.
Go ahead, Rabbi.
So, go back to the house of worship. It's not just about prayer. It's if you have a program in the house of worship that people don't like, right? Does that change anything?
No. No. I mean, it's part of the work of the House of Worship. And if they have a program, I mean, look, people may come out to protest the program. They may disagree, not violently, but something just short of that. And that's really what we see quite often here in New York City. People don't like the subject matter of a program. They're going to come out and protest. The question is, can they disrupt the program inside the House of Worship? No, they can't. Can they protest loudly? And if the level of their protest makes it difficult to hear inside the House of Worship, that may require them to move a little bit further back from the outside or maybe across the street. But it has to be a reasonable restriction that you place. And it doesn't mean that they have to be silent. They can be as loud as they want in most cases, but they cannot behave in a way that completely drowns out the ability of the people inside the House of Worship to exercise programs, religion, prayers, whatever they would like inside the house.
Wow. It's interesting because we're redefining so many things today, and we use that as a blanket term. Well, I have free speech, but there's consequence, and especially in cancel culture. You will be canceled in a minute if people disagree with what you have to say. But I'm more concerned about clergy, from the pulpit, espousing certain doctrines, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism or anything like that. How does the government respond to that? Or, are they allowed to, given free speech?
Reverend, this is difficult topic because the reality is that people have the right to be racist and espouse racist doctrine and anti-Semitic doctrine. The best example is the Ku Klux Klan marching in Skokie. Not only did they have the right to march in Skokie, but the town, Skokie, had the obligation to keep them safe. So if it takes 250 police officers from Illinois to walk with 15 Ku Klux Klan members down the street in order to protect them from being injured, that's the obligation of the town. And by the way, the Ku Klux Klan doesn't have to pay for the services that they get. No. That's just part of the government's obligation to protect free speech.
One of the things, Alan, that I believe you've mentioned in a previous interview is that the best way to combat speech or hate speech is with your exercise of your free speech rights.
That's right.
When people talk about, what the others said, but the question is, well, what did you say to combat it? Right.
To me, more speech, the better. There may be speech that I disagree with, and it is hurtful, and it has consequences. But to me, the only response to that is to have more speech. If someone takes a position that you think is racist or anti-Semitic, you have the right to correct them, to disagree, to argue, to yell, all of those things. You have the right to educate people as to what you think the proper position is. But it's as I said before, the First Amendment is messy because we all want our First Amendment rights, except if that person's rights disagree with what you think. And that's not the way it works.
And does it have to be true? I mean, can I say things that are not true? And I know they're not true, but, I want to influence the public in a certain direction concerning a particular movement, ideology, or person, or faith or race. I have the freedom to say things that are not true. Is that correct?
Yes, you do. You have the right to say things that are not true. You don't have the right to defame someone, as what we were saying before. But you don't have to be accurate in your speech, and you can exaggerate in your speech, and you can use hyperbole. And that is protected speech, unless it crosses a certain line to either be defamatory, slanderous, or fighting words. You have the right to be wrong.
Right. Alan Abramson, always a pleasure to have you on the air. You and I go back many years, Alan.
Yes, we do.
Yeah,
yes, we do.
It's always been an honor.
it's always, I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to be able to come on the show and to talk about these topics. And it's so important that we have these discussions and people weigh in on these discussions. That's what we need.
Yeah.
More talk like that.
Yeah. Well, in keeping with your tradition, Alan, we do this for you pro bono. All right.
And you're the first one, Alan, that received a musical introduction in the history of the show.
Go.
I just want you to know.
I don't have to pay for the rights of that, do I? I mean,
Well, if you,
I'm going to leave that with Rabbi. It was his
if
idea.
we do, we're calling an Alan Abramson.
there you go.
Another pro bono case for you. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Alan Abramson. Stay tuned for more of the Rev and the Rabbi this Sunday morning right here on Red Apple Radio Network.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Reb, this is the part of the program where you and I have a chance to talk with one another about things that have been said or things that we once said. You shared with me an email this past week about protest, the development of protest, that, if I remember, it doesn't just stop with words. The words should lead to action. If you're protesting something, you want something cured. You have to do something about it. So you can yell, but at the end of the day, the yelling in and of itself doesn't accomplish very much.
You know, in our faith tradition, we get, and look, I'm going to pull a text from the Hebrew Scriptures. Please. Because in Proverbs, there's a beautiful passage that says, hope deferred makes the heart sick.
Right.
Hope deferred makes the heart sick. And you know the Hebrew word hala there, which means not only disease, but it means worn out.
Right.
To have your patience and your tolerance exhausted. And protest, advocacy, activism, all of these things usually happen when people reach a breaking point. There's an issue that just they feel the only way that they can respond to what they perceive as broken systems, broken structures, injustice, is by gathering and expressing their displeasure. And this goes back, like you said, goes back to Scripture. If you read the book of Nehemiah, there was social protest before the building of the wall because people gathered and they said, well, we don't like the way things are being run by the government, and we want to see some change. Protest is healthy. Interesting thing, if you know the history in America, all right, it depends on who's protesting. If you have those who are protesting for civil rights, equal treatment under the law, etc., those who want to preserve the status quo, preserve tradition, say, if you're protesting, you're breaking the law. You're disorderly and you're against law and order. But when it comes to the changes that they want to see happen, it's okay to protest. So it's back and forth. At what time does it suit whose agenda?
Yeah, look, you and I and so many others have protested over the years. Civil rights, we marched. When it came to the denial of rights for Soviet Jews, I remember many of us protested in front of the Soviet mission. When, going back to the Iran of years ago, that also promulgated such hatred. Ahmadinejad, who was then the president of Iran, came to New York. We protested. Many of us stood in front of the United Nations or Columbia University, which gave him a platform, said, we hate what you're saying. And so we recognized that you had to do something. What do they say? You demonstrate with your feet. And many of us did. And those who got arrested took the consequences of that. It was went on their record, whatever. But protest is rooted in religion, in our faith. That's why in Hebrew the word for community, kihila, has the word kol, voice in it, because when you're part of a community, you exercise your voice, your speech. So there's nothing. It's not wrong. If we disagree with the cause, obviously the other person's wrong. But protest in and of itself is not wrong. It's the right thing to do when you feel strongly about something.
Well, you said about speaking up, and there's responsibility. I'm referring to another passage in Proverbs where it says, "Speak up for those
I brought
who
you
cannot
over to our side.
Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Speak for the poor, the helpless, the marginalized. See that they get justice." So it is a biblical responsibility for us when we see injustice, when we see broken systems and marginalization, et cetera. We have responsibility to protest by using our voice. But we're missing a very important adjective, Rabbi, with the word protest, and it's the word peaceful. Peaceful protest. Because if protest begins to vandalize, to damage, to hurt, to assault, then that's not the kind of protest that, is normally agreed with. And then we come in conflict with the law. What say you on peaceful protest? This is the whole thing about Dr. King, nonviolent activism.
Look, I remember talking with a number of college students who were being harassed on their campuses. And it was just not a protest. It was a prevention of people getting to class, where people stood in the way, besides calling them all kinds of offensive names, but they really made it difficult for them to walk to class. That, to me, is wrong. That's not allowed. You can say whatever you want, but you don't have the right to stand. You remember years ago with integration, with George Wallace, how people stood in the doorway to prevent African-American kids from getting into that building. So there are boundaries, legitimate boundaries that should be followed, but there are those who cross it. And by the way, the sad thing was with a number of those students who took over buildings and prevented people from going to class, they weren't punished. There was no consequence.
Look, we're children of the 60s and 70s, right? We know the sit-ins, nonviolent resistance and all of that to protest. Essentially, there was a war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, the things that were happening. And let me just say, Rabbi, protest is only one of the ways that we, speak up against injustice. It's one of the ways. It's the expression of moral outrage. But there's also something called convening, because when you've established the power to gather people around an issue, that's convening. And if you have a platform that you can share with voices that have an informed message, nothing crazy, or a platform that you're willing to lend to the conversation, convening is another way, gathering people around an issue and letting your voice be heard and known, that look at the numbers, of people who disagree with this particular issue or action. So it's protests, yes, which is, a specific crowd gathering and organizing around an issue and movement. But there is the power of convening people. There's advocacy, right?
Yeah. Well, look at the founding of the NAACP. I think if you look back, there was a Jew named Rosenwald who was very much a part of that beginning. And there are people who came together and say the only way to be more effective in this cause, as you say, is to convene and to communicate our discontent and then to cooperate with one another in presenting an alternative. Yeah. So, you can yell, but that has limitations in terms of effectiveness.
Yeah, and this was the effectiveness of Dr. King's March on Washington, to have over 250,000 people gather peacefully to express their discontent with the existing systems and structures in America, I don't think history has proven that moment of convening that number of people peacefully to make a point, that had a very powerful impact towards the changes that were made in this nation. So, yeah, people coming together like that, sharing a particular position and letting that be known. But again, in a peaceful way, that spoke volumes. Because if it was violent, people would have said, that's wrong. We're not going to change things. But that was critical. That was very, very critical.
I remember years ago also, a group of parents got together, I think it was in Massachusetts, to convene. They convened and they complained about the programming for children, which they thought was not appropriate. And they went after advertisers. And they got changes made. But, complaining without, content or without, you got to have a program with it. It can't just be complaining in a vacuum.
You brought up something else that's another element when it comes to pushing back against broken systems and pushing for reform. We've got to go to a break. When we come back, that's a very important subject matter because it's not just, gathering hundreds of thousands of people together carrying signs. There's another form of protest, and we're going to talk about it. Stay tuned for more of the Rev and the Rabbi right here on Red Apple Radio Networks.
Reverend A.R. Bernard, Rabbi Joseph Potasnik, the Rev and the Rabbi. Faith Matters, the Rev and the Rabbi.
Welcome back. I'm Rabbi Joseph Potasnik.
And I'm Reverend A.R. Bernard.
Let me also say thank you from the Rev and myself to Elias Raff, who's our producer week after week and does this so well. Thank you, Elias.
Yeah.
Rev, you wanted to bring that concept of protest another step further.
Yeah, and this is because of a book that I'm working on around social action. And, it's not just protesting, advocacy, activism, convening that we talked about, but development. That's where you look at what's broken and say, how can we respond? So, if the poor are struggling with affordable housing, what can we do? We have a large project in Brooklyn going on now. This is one of the ways of us using our land, all right, to respond to the issue of affordability. And this was 9 years ago that we started this process to do this. Education, that's a big deal. You and I have had situations where, the Jewish community has said, look, we've got to educate people about our community and anti-Semitism so they can understand the problems with that. We could look at the criminal justice system, healthcare, economic empowerment. There are so many positive ways to respond besides the convening of people and activism.
Yeah, I mean, I look at, you go by some of the hospitals, Mount Sinai, right? And you see all the Jewish names that were involved in that. There used to be Beth Israel in New York and Maimonides. And one of the reasons behind these so-called Jewish named hospitals is because Jewish doctors couldn't get jobs in other hospitals. And people said, wait a minute, we can't, we can protest, but what can we do effectively to change direction here? And what they did is they built hospitals. And eventually the hospitals that were denying entry to Jewish doctors were saying, wait a minute, we're losing out here. We're not going to get the talent we need to be a very, very effective presence in the community. So you always have to look, what is it we're going to do? Somebody once said that mitzvah is not just about a creed, it's about a deed. What are you doing? Not just how does belief get translated into behavior? And I think that's a challenge, and that's what we clergy, we've stood at many gatherings, many protests, and we've said, this is unacceptable, and this is what you need to do. So it's not just about the power to say no. It's about the power to no, and let's find a better way.
Absolutely, and that is about finding a better way. Look, HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, came about because blacks weren't allowed into the white universities. Right. So it's always been a response to these realities of American history. I love this country. This country is an amazing experiment. And that's exactly what it is, an experiment, which means you test different things, you try different things. And when they don't work, you challenge them, and every people who have come into this country have had to face what it means to integrate, or even those who chose to assimilate. And that's the thing about your history, Rabbi, going back all the way to the Exodus, all right? The greatest challenge for Egypt was the fact that the Jewish people, the Hebrews, were located, right, in Goshen, specifically, and you kept certain traditions and cultural identity. So you didn't, as a people, assimilate into Egyptian culture. You interacted with it, but you didn't assimilate. And that creates a problem often for the dominant culture when you hold on to certain traditions. Here in America, we learn to appreciate that, but those differences. Rabbi?
There was an article I read recently that says, we have the privilege of being hated. I think Brett Stevens wrote it about Jews. But one of the points is, why is there a privilege of being hated? Because they hated you because you were different. Because you maintained your standards. You refused to, succumb to their demands and said, no, we're going to protect and preserve who we are as a people. And you get hated for that. But you know what? It's all right. It's worth the price to preserve your existence. And we Jews have done that over years, and we paid a price for it, but we're not going to. That's why I mentioned to you, one of the topics that I thought was important is I don't have patience for people who dilute somebody else's tradition. We have Passover, for example. Passover has a message. It's about entrance into the promised land, redemption. Don't dilute that. Don't create some Seder and say that's Passover. It's not. It's something you created, and you're entitled to do whatever you want. But don't do it in our name.
See, right there, you're mentioning a very important tension, all right? Because dilution is not the same as development. Development deepens the understanding. It deepens the meaning while preserving the essence of the tradition. But when you dilute something, all right, you retain identity, but you weaken meaning. You weaken authority. You weaken the practice, and it begins to move away from the original power. Ritual, it becomes ritual without conviction, belief without any specific practice of those beliefs. So you hit on something very, very important there, Rabbi.
So you see these articles that are appearing now about young people returning to houses of worship. I've read a number of them about young people going back to the church and young people going to synagogues in different areas. Why is it? What is it that draws them? And I think it's a search for authenticity. They don't want plastic. They want the real. And that's why people don't want this dilution. Don't give me this one-size-fits-all that, is not what my tradition says it is. So I think being real and telling it as it was and as it should be now is something that's our responsibility. If I go to your church on a holiday, I know exactly what the holiday is. I know because you talk about it, you teach it. You come into a synagogue, a holiday, same thing. And that's what young people, I think, want. Tell me what my tradition says to me. You can talk about other issues, but make sure it's rooted in an understanding of what tradition wants of me.
Yeah. Look, we live in look, our young people have inherited a world, Rabbi, where everything is accessible. It's all about accessibility, but very little anchors them. Instead, they feel transient. You know what I mean? Hyper individualism takes over, and when that takes over, you're unmoored, you're untethered, and you fail to understand the importance of having anchors. So you start seeking it because you feel like you're drifting. And I think these young people are returning. Our congregation is growing. Families are coming, and young families are coming in because you're looking for meaning. You're looking for purpose. And they're hungry. And like you said, but they're looking for authenticity. So they're looking not for performance and entertainment, which unfortunately, many in the Protestant community, especially evangelical churches here in America, have espoused a what is called an attraction church model.
Wow.
And they do everything to just attract people. But people are attracted, and once they get there, they need formation. They need roots. They need discipling. They need growth and development within the context of community. It can't be just a wonderful concert every once a week. You know what I mean?
So what you're saying is you can be creative, be creative within the context of your tradition.
Right. Yeah.
So Billy Jonas
meaning and purpose.
Billy Jonas had that song "God Is In," and it seems now that there's a revival. God is in. People want to know, what does God want of me? You know, and I look at the astronauts. Some of them quoted scripture, right? A soldier risking his life will often recite a certain prayer based on, based on a certain scriptural passage. So God is in, and we always have that psalm, God is in the midst of the city, but God is in the midst of human beings who really want the real thing, not some artificial alternative.
Yeah, you and I have had the conversations about the fact that we're lacking moral clarity in this world. So a lot of these young people are asking the question, is there a moral structure to reality? Or is it simply, your truth, my truth, whatever truth you want? And they're tired of being told, create your own truth. They're realizing there's got to be something objective, something transcendent that we all must share. There's got to be a standard. And I think that this is what's driving them back also to their house of worship.
I got a call from someone recently, very successfully, very well known, who said to me, Rabbi, I've done very well financially. I've been very successful using the financial standard. But I can tell you this, there's a great void in my life. I'm missing a relationship with God, and I want to know more about my tradition. I welcome that kind of call, because I think many people simply want to know better. What does it mean being a Jew, a Christian, whatever the faith is, what does it mean? And we have a responsibility to tell the person what it is in real terms, not some kind of, hyperbolic or exaggerated. Tell them the real thing. Tell me the truth.
Absolutely.
All right.
And great conversation, Rabbi. Always a pleasure spending my Sunday morning with you and this amazing audience across our nation, an amazing nation at that. So thank you for joining us this Sunday morning and every Sunday morning right here on the Rev and the Rabbi.